President Thomas Jefferson won approval from Congress in 1803 to fund an exploratory group through the lands between the Mississippi River and the Pacific coast. The exploratory group would be known as the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson's secretary, and Lewis's friend, William Clark. They had a long trip ahead of them that would go on for the next 4 years, encountering rivers and lands and Indians that were unseen and untouched by Americans up to this point. There were 33 members of the Corps of Discovery, along with Seaman, Captain Lewis's dog. Toussaint, Charbonneau, and Sacagawea were recruited to be interpreters as the Corps realized that they would need some help in communicating with American Indians along the way. Although this expedition would be the first Americans to this region, there had been American Indians living in this part of the country for many years prior. The Corps of Discovery encountered around 50 American Indian tribes along the way, but because of time, I will discuss the tribes that had the most significant impact with the expedition. When the Corps first met a tribe, they had a ritual where they gave the Indians a peace medal and explained that the United States now owned their land. They would also give the Indians some presents, such as silk ribbons, scissors, tomahawks, knives, or face paint. The Corps left St. Louis on May 14, 1804, and headed up the Missouri River into Missouri and Oto Indian Territory. These tribes were away hunting buffalo when Lewis and Clark came through. However, they met up with the Corps at their campsite and held the first formal meeting between representatives of the United States and the American Indians. During the council, the Indians were advised to make peace with the other tribes and to send a delegation to Washington to meet with the president. This council would set the routine for the future meetings with tribes, and the first Indian encounter went pretty well. They were now headed for Sioux territory in South Dakota, and President Jefferson had warned about the Sioux. They first came upon the Yankton Sioux, and the meeting was pretty peaceful despite the tribe's disappointment with the gifts that had been given to them. The Teton Sioux, however, greeted Lewis and Clark with hostility and demanded that the Corps give them a boat to pass through their lands. Lewis and Clark were ready to fight, but the chief Black Buffalo stepped in and stabilized the encounter. Because no one spoke Sioux, there were many misunderstandings, and Lewis and Clark deemed it best to continue upriver. The Corps then encountered the Arikara tribe. They were greeted warmly and stayed with the tribe for 5 days. They were intrigued by Captain Clark's slave, as they had never seen a black man before. They believed he had special powers, and they nicknamed him Big Medicine. Averaging about 15 miles a day, the Corps reached the Mandan Indians in North Dakota. They built a fort and spent the winter there, as the relations were cordial. The Americans traded goods for food and even joined the Mandans on a buffalo hunt. They also learned valuable information about the course of the Missouri River. Unlike the Mandans, the Hidatsa Indians were always involved in fighting with other tribes. The Mandans didn't want the Corps to trade with them, so they told the Hidatsas that the Americans were going to raid their villages. When Lewis went to make peace with them and expel the rumor, they didn't trust him and received him reluctantly. When he suggested that they make peace with neighboring tribes, they weren't convinced. Although it wasn't a cordial meeting, Lewis and Clark did gain Sacagawea and Charbonneau from this meeting. They would become the interpreters. The interpretation process was actually quite complicated, as Sacagawea would talk to her husband and then he would translate those words into French. When understood, someone would then pass this information on to Lewis and Clark. They also used sign language, as some of the Corps of Discovery could understand it. Sacagawea gave birth to a baby boy in 1805, and he also accompanied them on the journey to the west. As the Mandan villages were great trading hubs, the Assiniboine traveled to meet the Corps of Discovery. The meeting was cordial, but the Assiniboines felt threatened by trade between the Americans and the Mandans, so they threatened them with military action. Because of this, Lewis and Clark were very eager to avoid contact with them in their travels west. The next encounter with Indians would be the Blackfeet in northern Montana. The Blackfeet were nervous at first, but then decided to camp with the Americans. Lewis explained the United States' goals for peace between the tribes, but the Blackfeet were concerned about their enemies receiving guns, so they attempted to steal guns from the Corps. 2 Blackfeet warriors were killed, and this marked the first and only bloodshed on the journey. The relationship with the Blackfeet continued on as one of hostility. With the help of Sacagawea, the Corps negotiated with the Shoshone to trade their horses in exchange for guns. Sacagawea recognized the chief as her brother, which helped to solidify the agreement. Captain Lewis promised them guns on their return trip, saying white men would come to them with a number of guns and every other article necessary to their defense and comfort. The Nez Perce men were gone when Lewis and Clark came upon their villages west of the Rocky Mountains. The Indians greeted them warmly with a meal and gave them information on the road ahead. They spoke a different language than most Indians in the east, but overall relations were good. Because of the warm relationship, the Corps stayed with the Nez Perce for a month while the snow melted. On encountering the Walla Walla Indians in southern Washington, the Corps were desperately trying to get to the Pacific Ocean, so they promised to stop on their way back through. They traded for kettles, and Chief Yellowpit gave Clark a white horse to demonstrate their good intentions. Yellowpit urged them to stay another night and then gave them food, canoes, and horses, and they partied together before the Corps' departure. The Wishram Indians lived on the north side of the Columbia River. When Lewis and Clark reached their village, they noticed their large wooden houses and were impressed by them. They had an abundant supply of salmon that they gave to their visitors. Lewis and Clark were also proud that the Nez Perce and Wishram negotiated a peace agreement while they were there. Lewis and Clark came to the tip of Oregon where the Clatsop Indians resided. Because their greeting was warm, the Corps decided to build a fort there for the winter. Clatsop were always helpful to the explorers, informing them about food supplies and preparing them for the winter. The Chinook lived along the banks of the Columbia River and the coast of the Pacific Ocean. Lewis and Clark noted that they wore little and had flat foreheads and pointed craniums. The first encounters were peaceful as the Indians presented them with deer meat and root bread cakes. However, the Chinooks were known to steal, so the Corps were always on their guard when in their presence. The Tillamook Indians lived on the northwest coast of Oregon. Lewis and Clark encountered these Indians because of the information they had received from the Clatsop about the whale washing ashore. They traded goods for 300 pounds of blubber and oil. Lewis and Clark continued to have Indian encounters on their return trip, but overall the expedition was a huge success. They met thousands of Indians, and only one of the encounters was violent, resulting in the death of 2 Indians.